Hi, my name's Dave. My business is called People and Risk, and I help organisations tackle safety and risk through a specific focus on people and culture. So in this video, I'm going to talk about safety and performance measurement and metrics. And I'm going to start by saying, I don't think safety can be measured, but I'm also going to say, I think we can sometimes measure safety and that can have some meaningful output. So let's get into it. I don't want this just to be a bash up. Like, I think there's enough conversation around the challenges of metrics, but what I want to explore is sort of why. And I'm going to explore it through this sort of lens of trade-offs. And the reason I sort of frame it this way is I found that when I'm working with organisations, there's sort of an acceptance of some of the problems that we've created, so that some things in safety we do can actually increase risk unintentionally. But I've found that when I'm working with senior leaders, I need to give them a context as to kind of why it's happening and a viable alternative. And I've found that trade-offs is a bit of a conversation around that. So essentially what I'd say is there are more negative trade-offs with creating numbers and metrics for safety performance than positive. Now I'm going to frame these trade-offs in a couple of different ways, in a few different ways, sorry. I'm going to talk about the idea of sort of data or a number and meaning. Just trust me, that's what it says. I'm going to talk about simplicity versus complexity when we talk about reporting and numbers, and I'm also going to talk about questions and suggest that sometimes it's the nature of the question which can lead us down an interesting path. So we're going to start by talking about safety and start at the very traditional end and think about the outputs. So there's still a really strong anchor in terms of what is sort of safety about, where we get anchored to it being about harm and injury. Now, this is because there are still a lot of organisations that measure safety that way. Maybe it's just external, but there's still a bunch that do lost time injury frequency reporting. So we're still creating that a report, even if it's not the only one. And I'll talk about performance indicators in a minute, but they still talk about safety and produce a number, right? There's also a really strong anchor with home, and this comes from workshops I run where I ask often, senior, middle, frontline personnel, what is safety about? And it's still probably, depending on the industry or the organisation, half to nearly 90% of people still anchor in some way to that. So this introduces one of these sort of first challenges, right, of measuring injury rates is just a number. It's just a data point. Like, so what? But nothing's neutral. When we think about, and my view is from a cultural view, it's a people and culture view, nothing's neutral, everything has meaning and everything has trade-offs. So what happens is we produce a number or a graph, and that number is given meaning, and it's typically given meaning by senior leaders initially. And what they'll often do generically is if the number's going up, it means it's less safe, and if the number's going down, it's more safe. And we've known for a long time that's simply not true, that our injury rates, particularly lost time injury, does not reflect how safe we are. At a frontline level though, this is also happening. So it's sort of causing a number of negative trade-offs. First of all, it just hides what's really going on at a senior level. But at a frontline level, what we're doing is accidentally teaching people that as long as you made it home, it was safe. And that's just not true. If everyone gets home for a month or a week, was it safe for that week or month? And the answer should be not necessarily. What about the reverse? If somebody is injured, does it automatically mean it was unsafe? And I think the answer should be not necessarily. So we've known about this. I'm not trying to bang up on it, but I'm saying nothing's neutral, right? And one of the problems of it is because of this data and meaning. We're just saying we're producing a number, but it's given meaning. And one of the things that happens is because of the simplicity and the complexity trade-off. When incidents occur, for example, there is a rich set of data produced. There's stories, there's information, there's meaning created around it. But by the time it gets reported up at a senior level and gets distilled down to a graph, all the information is stripped out of it. So all the meaning is gone, which means the people reading it have to add the meaning back in. They haven't read the report, they don't know what was going on. So they add in and they make it mean that a higher number means less safe and a lower number means more safe. So again, it's the way we communicate it, what it means. And what I'm suggesting is we may need to sort of be willing to let go of safety metrics, meaning safety performance. That's the distinction I'd say here. And the reason for it is because of the degree of negative trade-offs it leads to. So this anchor to metric and numbers has a number of negative trade-offs in there. Now, we've known about this for a long time, so that's why somebody went, hey, what about if we thought about things that are inputs to safety? Now, here's another problem here, because the trade-off is in the question. So the question went from, well, okay, if we don't measure lag indicators, what else could we measure? Now, embedded in that question is still the belief that you can measure safety performance as a number. Just like, not so nobody said, hey, wait a minute, can we measure safety? They just said, what else should we measure? The question assumed there is just simply another way. And I'm going to consistently say, I don't think that's true. I don't think we can distill down safety, which I view as a dynamic outcome of a number of inputs and traits, as a number. Because if I ask that other question of not so much what else can we measure, but if I said, well, what else are the inputs to safety? And this is a question I ask frontline, middle, senior leaders, whatever it is. I say, well, what are things that actually contribute to safety? We get a lot of answers. The question is, are all of them measurable? And that's where we get this distinction. I'm not asking what else can we measure. I'm interested in what else contributes to safety and how do we focus on that more than just whether we got home. So I'll give you some examples of the things that people talk about. I do get stuff like people. Now, they typically don't say people, but what that accumulates to is things like awareness, experience, training, knowledge. They will talk about equipment. So having fit for purpose equipment, the right tools, access to PPE. Might talk about things like care, right? Might talk about communication, radical things like trust and support and listening. Also, risk, as in one of the inputs to safety is managing risk. Now, this comes from asking the question. I'm not making this up. I've found that if I ask people, tell me about things that contribute to safety, these are the types of answers that people give. The question then becomes, can we measure them? And that's where the dilemma arises. That's where the trade-off. Because to try and measure some of these things, we're going to run into some of these trade-offs up here around simplicity and complexity. And typically, what we have is this trade-off around qualitative versus quantitative. So if we think about communication, what is it about communication that contributes to safety? Well, I would argue it's things like, are we on the same page? Does everyone have the information they need? Now, can we measure that as a metric? I don't know that you can. So what we end up though, because our question was, what can we measure? It ends up getting distilled down to a simple thing of, well, we can measure activity. We can measure how many toolboxes we've done. Can we measure risk? Can we actually measure what's the current level of risk? Very difficult. I mean, I can measure how many risk assessments have been done, but it's activity, not the quality or the traits. See, I think these are traits, qualities, properties. Some of them, there's stuff in here like personnel also say things like procedures and rules contribute towards it. So can we measure that? Well, we can measure the existence of it, but can we measure how many people are following rules? Well, yeah, but that starts getting into some very compliancy-like behavior. So I'm not saying you can't measure any of it, but is it that, well, this is this other fundamental thing. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Now, I think that's a load of crap. I think all of these things are valuable inputs to safety. I think that we're currently managing, most organisations I work with are currently managing all of these things, and yet you can't meaningfully measure most of them, certainly not through metric data. And it's the act of trying to measure that creates these negative trade-offs. And that's where I'm asking organisations to sort of really reflect and say, if we want to take a more mature approach to risk, and I think risk is at the core of all this stuff, if we want to take a more mature approach towards risk, we need to fundamentally reflect on what we're doing. And we need to shift the meaning of data and metrics out from performance and say, well, what do we want to do with data? Data can give us insights. It can help us have conversations and learn. But also, what do we want to measure? So if we're able to move away from a metric, like I could put some of these things on a scale and say, just are we on the same page? Have a think about experience and this job we're about to do. Where would you kind of rate us on having the right experience mix in this group. Now, people can come up with this as a qualitative. I'm putting it on a scale just to give them something to anchor to, but I'm not trying to measure it and say, right, you're that safe. I'm trying to go, okay, well, we're here. What does that mean? Do we think that's an acceptable risk for this job? So I'm using data. In this case, it's typically going to be qualitative data for a much different purpose. I'm trying to shift the meaning of it. And I get that this is a radical change for some organizations, but I think it's an important one because I think I'm starting from the point of view of most of our traditional safety metrics, even leading indicators, can often end up fooling us. And I think it comes back to this question of, we asked, what else can we measure? Not, should we measure it? You know, that's that sort of fundamental question. So thanks for listening. Have a think about that. Welcome any feedback. Thanks.